All right, people, let's talk aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Obviously, this is a big part of that question too on the macro. And so we need to address it a little bit. It's one of those things I wish I could have been with you when we were learning this, like face to face. I think it would make it a lot easier. Hopefully, it's starting to grow on you a little bit. I do think it's actually a nice wrap up of all the different things that sort of go into the economy. Let's start with what our axes are, right? You can label this a bunch of different things. Tend to like real GDP as the best option. You can also label it as output. You can label it with a Y. Again, we're not graphing, right? But just so you understand all the different ways it could be listed, right? You're more than likely going to hear real GDP or output in one of the questions, or I guess read, you're not hearing it. Then up at the top is always going to be price level. And again, in your brain, you should sort of associate price level with inflation rates. It's a big part of what we're talking about there. So let's start with our short run. Okay. You've got aggregate demand, which means total demand from everybody, governments, businesses, individuals, net exports, all that. You've got your short run aggregate supply, which is the only reason I'm putting short run in there is to differentiate from long run. And so again, the wording may, dictate that it's specifying short run versus long run. So I think it's good to see it. And so what this is telling you in this moment, what is our real GDP or what is Y, okay? This is also then going to dictate what our current price level or inflation rate is actively at. Now, what a lot of the questions are asking about is this current situation in relationship to the long run. And obviously, one of those big situations that we could be dealing with is a recession. And if that's the case, our long run is really going to be more than our recessionary phase. And so our long run aggregate supply would be over here. God, that is the worst straight line I've ever drawn in my entire life. This over here is going to be that recessionary gap that you're dealing with. And so when you're given something like the marginal propensity to consume and they want you to use the tax multiplier or the spending multiplier, and they're dealing with the gap, that's the gap they're referring to, is the difference between what you can at your natural rate of output produce versus what you're actively producing in this moment. And remember that natural rate of output over here is saying, like, if you've used all of your resources to their max, so you're at the natural rate of unemployment, you're 4 to 6% labor or unemployment, right? You've used your resources that are, your natural resources, you've used your money, all of that sort of stuff. And so you've got this just sort of, we should be able to produce this much. And it doesn't matter what the price level is. It just matters that that's the most we can produce, no matter what everything costs, given all of our resources. Okay. Now, a big part of the question is going to focus on, well, how do we fix that gap? And aside from dealing with your spending multiplier and your tax multiplier, you could just allow the economy to naturally fix itself. And I think this is one of the questions from the other day. So let's start with, if the government and the Federal Reserve take no action for whatever reason, they want no part of it, they're not doing anything. Well, if you're in the middle of a recession, it's very unlikely that people are just all of a sudden going to demand more. In fact, the longer a recession goes on, the less aggregate demand you will have, because more and more people will find themselves unemployed. More and more businesses will shut down throughout. It's pretty unlikely that aggregate demand will change unless something else happens first. And what's more likely to happen is that eventually, with this high rate of unemployment that you're seeing, which is also represented here to a certain extent, you would see workers willing to take lower wages than they were before, right? The person who used to be above working at the grocery store as a cashier because they were, I don't know, a dentist. I mean, I guess you're still a dentist during a recession, but whatever. They had some other career, and all of a sudden that career is not an option for them because of this recession. And maybe for the first year, while they were still collecting unemployment, they were like, I'm better off on unemployment than going to work at the grocery store. But then 2 years down the line, once those unemployment benefits run out, they're willing to take lower wages. And because they're willing to accept those lower wages, firms are now able to produce more. And it kind of goes back to what we did with supply and demand at the start of the year. If your resources are cheaper, in this case, your labor is cheaper, then you have more money to buy the other resources that you need, and you can then produce more. And so as soon as people are willing to take lower wages, you can see your short run aggregate supply increasing. If that's the case, what you would end up resulting in is down the line a lower price level. Right, that's one option. But let's face it, our government and the Fed don't tend to just put their hands up anymore, right? We saw what happened during the Great Depression and various other recessions where if you don't take any action, it's very unlikely that it'll resolve before you have a huge catastrophe on your hands. So that's one option. If you just let the economy fix itself, you have to wait until your short run aggregate supply can increase because people are willing to take those lower wages. Now, more than likely, though, the government is going to take some kind of steps to mitigate this recession, and the Federal Reserve on its own will also go ahead and take steps to try and fix it. So let's take a look at what happens if that's the case. So we've got our recessionary gap, we've got our price level, and we're over here with our long run. Well, that's a much nicer curve. Okay. And so what happens is that when the government spends money to try and encourage aggregate demand to increase, when the government gives a tax cut to try and encourage aggregate demand to increase, when the Fed increases the money supply to lower interest rates, which will in turn cause aggregate demand to increase, what will happen is that over time, that aggregate demand, right, not all in one like fell swoop, but that aggregate demand will increase. You'll return back, to this particular final Y. But look what happens to price level, right? Price level will increase because when people demand more and aggregate supply doesn't change, price level goes up and you have inflation. Now, you're probably thinking, but won't aggregate supply probably also shift as well? Yeah, it probably will, but don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. The initial thing is that those actions taken by the Fed and the government will increase aggregate demand and shift you to the right. Now, let's for argument's sake say that instead of a recession, we're dealing with overproduction situation. I think I've seen one free response question asked this in the entire time that I have been teaching this course and tech, all the past exams I went and looked at. So let's say in this scenario, though, we have our aggregate supply, our aggregate demand. We're at our current production point, but let's say it's actually beyond where we're supposed to be able to produce. Maybe we are seeing a lower unemployment rate than the 4 to 6% normal over here, which, we were seeing before this whole Corona thing. Maybe, I don't know, there's just like a glut of some resource that all of a sudden lets us produce more in the short run, right? This could happen. It absolutely could. But what we're seeing is this price level, right, is likely higher than the price level that we were dealing with before. Okay. And so the government, their best bet if they're trying to reduce that price level is to discourage spending. And one of the ways the government can discourage spending is by increasing interest rates. It will, one, discourage people from buying cars and homes because interest rates are now ridiculously high. But at the same time, it also encourages people to save their money because higher interest rates means people want to save more. And so what could happen because of that is that you actually see your aggregate demand decrease, which could bring that price level down. Again, I don't think you're likely to see this. Really, you're more so going to see a recessionary situation. Hopefully this makes sense. And again, always ask me questions.